You are listening to TBR Radio Presents The DIXIE Heritage Show, with your host, the Director of DIXIE Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Our guest on today's TBR Radio Presents The DIXIE Heritage Show is William Chad Newsom. William Chad Newsom is the developer of what is known as the Christendom Curriculum. It is a Christian nationalist homeschool curriculum. It is providing what we call a classical education for Christians and others to use in their homeschooling efforts. This is a very unique curriculum because not only does it teach traditional Christian values, but it also is a curriculum that is designed to train your child to be a warrior in the culture war, as our monuments, as our history, as our heritage, as our very way of life is coming under attack by Marxism and by groups like Antifa, as our monuments are being torn down, as liberalism is just running rampant throughout our country. We are in a culture war, and so we have to train our children to be the next generation of culture warriors, because I'm just going to say it, their parents and their grandparents have been failing abysmally at this whole culture war thing. Okay? So we need to train our children to be cultural warriors, or there will not be a culture. There will not be a Western civilization for them to live in within the next couple of decades. And so the Christendom curriculum is designed to do just that, to prepare your children and your grandchildren to be culture warriors, to fight for our heritage, for our history, for our civilization. And so rather than trying to tell you all about it, I'm going to let its developer, William Chad Newsom, do that for us. So 4 minutes ago, a story hit the AP wire. I know it's not what we plan to talk about today, but 4 minutes ago, the story hit the AP wire that Bernie Sanders is out.
Is that right? I hadn't heard it yet. What?
Yeah, 4 days ago, the Democrat establishment was leaning on him really heavy to drop out, and he was like, no. And today, he's like, I don't have a clear path. I'm out. They haven't even had a primary since this pandemic began. Bernie Sanders' path is still as clear as it ever was, and they can say Biden has more delegates, but that's only because he picked up Buttigieg's delegates, and he picked up Klobuchar's delegates, and, he picked up everybody else's delegates. Bernie Sanders has still earned more delegates than Biden has in this thing.
Yeah, and Biden's looking more and more insane every day. He's looking less and less viable, I think. So, yeah, that's strange.
Yeah,
but there's been a lot of pressure to get him out, I know.
So I wonder what in the world's going on, but, something's rotten in the state of Denmark and apparently in the United States Democratic Party as well.
Oh, definitely.
Tell me about your homeschool curriculum. It's called the Christendom Curriculum. And how did you pick that name?
So the name was chosen because of the focus of the curriculum. It's a back to basics curriculum. It's similar to the Robinson, for those who may be familiar with that. It's a 3 R's type of curriculum. But what's different about it is that it's focused on the kingdom of Christ ruling over the nations. So this comes into the fact that it's a Christian nationalist curriculum. It's not nationalism simpliciter, it's Christian nationalist, which means the Bible's doctrine of the nations. And so that was one of the things I saw that's a bit neglected in the homeschool world, and I wanted to focus on that. So Christendom is the best name that we have for sort of encapsulating what we mean by Christ's rule. It's not just, in my view, it's not just a spiritual kingdom that has no impact on earthly things, as some folks would say. And I think that the Bible teaches clearly that God's intention is to rule his people through Christ and through the people in their nation. The Great Commission focuses on discipling the nations, not just handing out tracts to everybody, not just making sure everyone in the world gets to see the Jesus movie at least once, but actually discipling the nations as nations. So that's where the name came from.
Well, you mentioned nations. I gave a speech at the Antietam battlefield, I want to say it was back maybe in June, and it caused quite a bit of a stir back then. I was talking about the biblical definition of a nation. And so, what we think of when we use the term nation quite often is actually a state or a government. But the biblical definition of a nation is totally, totally different. So why don't you just go ahead and share that with us? Biblically speaking, what is a nation?
Yes, I mean the Greek word used in the New Testament is, of course, ethnos. We get our word ethnicity from it. It's tied to a people, a specific people. So John Jay said in one of the Federalist Papers that Providence has granted to the American people a common language, a common religion, and a common ancestry. So it's about that as much as it is anything else. And I think that I've experienced the exact same thing you talked about. When I say nationalism, people think that I mean statism in some variety. But in fact, most nationalists I know tend to want smaller, less powerful, less intrusive government, more local government. And so it's definitely not that. But they confuse the nation with the state. The state is, as you said, it's the government apparatus, but the nation is the people.
Well, the reason I think that Rome lasted for as many centuries as it did is because the Romans had figured out how to have multiple nations operating under the umbrella of the same empire or the same state or the same government. Our government, our state, our empire, the American empire, if you will, has not figured that out yet. We're trying to unify what are actually multiple nations dwelling on the same continent into one homogeneous, call it what you want, and it's just not working.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the failure of multiculturalism. It wants to force people together that really have nothing in common, and that's just a recipe for violence and disaster, as we're seeing. In fact, we're a very divided state at this point.
So people think that if the nationalists have their way, that it would be the end of the United States, but it doesn't necessarily have to go down that way.
Very true. Yeah, I think for one thing that I think we have to fight the enemy that's in front of us, maybe not the enemy we would prefer to fight. And right now the enemy is globalism. And I think for the moment at least, the United States has a role to play in defeating globalism, at least as we are right now. It's still very chaotic. But I think under Trump, we've become for the first time in a long time the enemy of this globalization tendency. So what we need to do is work on defeating globalism first. And I think that will establish the principle of nationalism to such a point that then the various, because I agree with you that we're not one nation here on this continent, we're many nations, and the various nations, the various peoples here can then begin to make the case for being allowed to govern themselves more in their own cultural way. And yes, it could still involve some kind of confederacy called the United States, but just with more states' rights, more emphasis on local culture, custom, and tradition. That's what I think would be the best outcome if we can do it without violence. But yeah, I think that nationalism is in the ascendancy right now, but we still have a long way to go. And the first step is to get these big monsters out of the way, like the United Nations or the European Union or whatever. And then we'll see where it goes from there, because the principles will have been established, and then we can start applying them in a more local way, I think.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, read all
About globalism. Right now with the whole corona pandemic, Do you think that this pandemic, and myself personally, I will go ahead and say it. I've said it before. I'll say it again, and you may or may not agree with me. Part of me wonders if this is more manufactured crisis than actual crisis. But whether it's real or whether it's being artificially pumped up, do you think that the globalists are probably going to pick up 50, 60 yards on the football field with this pandemic?
No, quite the opposite, I think. What we're seeing is, and it may be a backfire from their perspective, but what we are seeing, I think, nationalist principles being shown to be superior in various ways. Far left globalist type politicians have closed their borders. We're being forced back to our communities, to our families. And I'm not denying because like you, I feel uncertain. The one thing I'm sure of is I don't believe the official stories that I'm hearing, but what the reality is, I wouldn't speculate too much. But even if it's a real thing with real suffering and deaths going on, as I think is likely, nevertheless, I see God's hand at this, kind of what I call a divine counterstrike. 5 years ago, some of the things we're seeing now would just have been unthinkable. We 5, 6, 7, you go back a little further, things like Brexit, things like Trump, and of course what we're seeing now, all the assumptions of this multicultural globalism are just being called into question. And I think when it's over, they'll try to rush back to the way things were before, but I think we may have just reached a point where that's not going to be so easy to do. So I think globalism is finding its first significant challenge in a while, not just through Corona, but Corona is the latest manifestation of that.
Right. Well, I know that as I've studied the history of pandemics, the Black Death it just devastated London. And one of the results of that was that the English feudal system collapsed. And, then we saw what we now, I guess, would know as capitalism take its place. And, I would say that was a good thing. Not that capitalism wouldn't be perverted over the next several hundred years, and it has been. But, but that was a good thing when it took place. And so now that our economic system is as messed up as it is and has been as bastardized as it has been, I'm hoping that maybe we'll see the same result. And of course, I have the benefit of looking back at medieval England. I'm looking backwards at it, and so I can't really see what happened to those people when their economic system collapsed. I'm sure it was devastating, but the end result was a blessing to them and to the entire world. And so I'm hoping that maybe we'll see the end of our current evil economic system and, something a little more righteous take its place, and maybe the world will get another, few hundred years of freedom.
Yes, I hope so too. That is exactly what I'm praying for. There's some speculation that some of Trump's recent moves are moves against the Federal Reserve, for example, just to take that in terms of economics. But yeah, I think people are beginning to question the sort of the economic side of open borders, which is free trade, and the relationship we've had with China, and saying, maybe this isn't the best way to do things. And when you reach a crisis like that, it becomes more obvious. Yeah, but the big thing is people are genuinely going through difficult times right now, economically, if nothing else. And but the hope is when God comes to shake things up, that he always brings resurrection out of death. He takes us down into the darkness for a time and then brings us up to a new morning. And I'm hoping and praying that that's what's happening here. I believe firmly that that's what's happening here. I think when you look at history, as you just mentioned, you can see the pattern. That's why one of my favorite quotes is Robert E. Lee's famous line, "It is history that teaches us to hope." So we have hope for the future, because this isn't the first time this kind of thing has happened. We've seen it before, and God knows what he's doing. He is the author of history, and as someone I read recently said, he's not writing a tragedy.
Well, you mentioned General Lee, and this is the Dixie Heritage Show. Explain to us why this curriculum is something that a Southern person who wants to pass their history and their heritage on to the next generation. Explain to me why it is that this is the curriculum that they need to pick up and that they need to use for that purpose.
Yes, I am a Southerner myself, and I consider myself to be a Southern nationalist. Some of our marketing materials, we say, defend America, rebuild the West. But America is not just the U.S. J.R.R. Tolkien once said, he said, "I love England, but I hate Great Britain." I feel similarly about our situation. I love America, but I'm not overly fond of what the United States has become. But it goes farther than that. America is not just the Stars and Stripes, and Southerners have a deep history here. So this curriculum, as a nationalist curriculum, lays the foundation for what I think more thoughtful Southerners are looking for. So there are plenty of curricula out there that will do the job in terms of just providing the basics, the 3 R's in the early years, the college prep subjects later on, and all of that, depending on what a person's goal is. But what I saw missing was this emphasis on Christian nationalism and an emphasis on culture war. That's the second piece of what makes us different. The first is Christendom, the second is culture war. And there's no more obvious sign of, or no more obvious battle in the culture war that we've seen recently, especially in terms of this being a very, very big optic, than the battle over Confederate monuments and memorials. That is the best sign of the intentions of our adversaries. They want to erase our history, our heritage, our heroes. They want to demonize our ancestors. And that's the culture war right there. So our curriculum teaches children the opposite of what they're taught in the culture, which is the culture, and this is one of the fundamental philosophical concerns that drove me to create this. I believe that our enemies very obviously want us to violate the biblical command to honor our fathers and mothers. They want us to dishonor our fathers and mothers, our ancestors in the faith, our ancestors by blood. I wanted to create something that taught children from a very early age to love their people, to love their ancestors, their land, their home. And these are things that Southerners know in our bones. These are things that make us who we are. We're not unique in that. Every nation has that love of land and love of place and love of people and family. But it's something that became very important to us in our history because of how things went with our bid for independence and all of that. So this curriculum will teaches children and teaches older children as well what the cultural war is, what the issues are, how to go out and fight it, and more. I think just as importantly as anything else, a philosophy of history believes in actual victory. That's important because I grew up in a theological milieu where we were taught that history was destined to dead end into disaster, and there was just no way. Things were supposed to get worse and worse, but in my view, the scriptures teach that the gospel of Christ will win, not just at the end when Christ comes back and says, everybody out of the pool, but in history. He expects us to fulfill the Great Commission to disciple the nations. So all these concerns make this, I think, somewhat unique among the homeschool curricula out there, and perhaps uniquely appealing to the Southern mindset. At least I hope so. That was the intention. Because, like I said, there's many that will do the job in terms of just doing the basics of education. But in terms of worldview guidance, it seems to me that the options we have out there are, I would say, mostly unaware of these issues, just not taking them into consideration at all. But to the extent that they do take them into consideration, they're actually compromised with some of the philosophical foes that we have to deal with, like critical race theory, cultural Marxism, and more at the camera level, I suppose, social justice in that narrative. I've heard from some of the members of my curriculum that even otherwise good curricula out there buy into the social justice thing. they give lots of praise to MLK. They denigrate our pioneers and our Southern ancestors, the founders of America. They overemphasize the contributions of slaves and Indians to the detriment of the European contributions. So it's all part of that narrative. And again, these are curriculum that might be fine in certain respects. I'm not painting them all with a bad and critical brush here, but they seem to either be just unaware of these issues or to some extent be compromised with them. And that's the gap I was trying to fill with this, to provide a good back to basics curriculum that a family could use, but that would not teach their children to hate themselves or to hate their ancestors or to dishonor, as I see it, their father and mother.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
You had mentioned, some of the other curriculums. For example, a lot of homeschoolers use the Abeka curriculum. And the Abeka curriculum is very critical of the South and of Southerners in its study of the war between the states. And obviously your curriculum would not be. I've noticed when I've looked at your curriculum is basically what we would call a classical education. And I don't know that there is any curriculum right now for Christian schools, for homeschools, that really still provide a classical education. That was the case maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I don't know that there are really any curriculums out there that focus on classical education anymore. But our Confederate ancestors and our Confederate heroes, they had all been the beneficiaries of the classical education. Talk just a little bit about that.
We are classical in the sense that we do use certain elements like the trivium, the threefold division of learning into grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Although we use the thinking of a fellow who puts it into five. He has two divisions that are younger than those three. So the trivium is an important element of classical education that we have retained, and as well as, of course, the focus on the great books of Western civilization. The higher education, especially, but even at lower levels in America, has rejected Western civilization to a great degree. There are many college English departments where you really don't have to read Shakespeare, for example. So we wanted to focus on those great books because that's our heritage. That's the inheritance that has been bequeathed to us, and we need to be good stewards of that. And we need to start producing generations of children that can begin to take up that mantle again. I don't think we're there yet. I think we've got about a 3-generation project ahead of us. We've got to first, kind of drive out the invaders and win the culture war. Then we've got to rebuild the culture, and finally we've got to beautify the culture. In the curriculum, we summarize those 3 generations as battle, building, and beauty. So I think in those respects, we are very much fellow travelers with classical education and our desire to return to Western literature and history, and of course a focus on what I consider to be a wise understanding of human nature with the trivium. Those aspects are classical for us. Before I did this years ago, I wrote for a curriculum published by Veritas Press that is also classical in nature. Did some great book stuff there, Shakespeare, C.S. Lewis, and Tennyson and others. So there are others out there that are doing it. But again, I think I have one of the families in my curriculum is part of a group called Classical Conversations, and I don't want to call them out particularly because I don't know for sure what they're like, say at their institutional level. But in this one mother's experience at a Classical Conversations co-op or setup that they do, they would hear the same kind of social justice type of spin on American history, and she's like, why am I hearing this here when that's supposed to be a classical education? So I think what's happened has been a lot of the very good curricula out there that are doing some good work in certain areas have just become compromised with the spirit of the age, unwittingly, I think. I think the problem is that so many just, it's inherent in us as Christians. We know we're to love our neighbor, we're to love even our enemies, as Christ taught us. And when people start calling us haters and anti-this and anti-that and racist, we think, well, that's not good. We're not supposed to be that. And so they kind of too easily buy into that narrative. So, yeah, I think there is some classical education out there. I think it is important, as you said, that was this was once the common coin of our founding fathers, of our Southern ancestors, was to get a great education in the books of our civilization and without the baggage that comes along with it today.
Well, we're just about out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show. So why don't you go ahead and tell us how we can find the Christendom Curriculum? There's a website, I know. How do we find it? How do we get a hold of you, and how do we order it?
It's ChristendomCurriculum.com. It's only $99.99 per year per family, nothing further to buy. You don't pay extra fees for extra children or anything like that. We wanted to keep the price low so that people could either use it as a full curriculum or supplement their existing curriculum with our emphasis on culture, war, and Christendom.
Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
And we are pretty much out of time now for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show, but I would like to thank you for being our guest and for joining us for this week's very insightful and interesting conversation with William Chad Newsom. After we finished the on-air portion of the interview, Mr. Newsom had mentioned to me that he would like to give a portion of the proceeds from people signing up for the Christendom Curriculum to Dixie Heritage to help us here in our work, in what we're doing to fight the culture war on our end. And so if you're interested in the Christendom Curriculum, and I hope you are, I mean, to be able to have an entire year's worth of curriculum for your child for just $99, I mean, that is just mind-blowing. And myself and our family, we're members of the Christendom Curriculum, and so we use the curriculum ourselves in our efforts to teach our child as well. And it's just a great resource. It's just a great tool, and I know you're going to get a lot of benefit from it. And so if you'll go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net, www.dixieheritage.net, and click on the homeschool button. It'll take you to a little page there, and you'll be able to read about the Christendom Curriculum. Follow the link on our website, www.dixieheritage.net, homeschool. Follow that link there, and it'll take you to the Christendom Curriculum, and you can sign up there. But when you do, a portion of your order there will go to help us in our ongoing fight to preserve the history and the heritage of the South here at Dixie Heritage. So I hope you'll do that. Also, while you're at dixieheritage.net, you can also sign up to receive my newsletter. There's no cost, no obligation. Every Friday, we'll email the Dixie Heritage newsletter to you, and it'll be full of information that you'll want to read each week. And when you sign up for the newsletter, I'll also send you absolutely free of charge a copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. So I hope that you'll avail yourself to those resources. And also, I hope you'll take the time to tune into my other radio show this week. TBR Radio presents the TBR History Hour. William Chad Newsom will be my guest over there, and we will have an even more detailed discussion about the Christendom Curriculum and the direction of homeschooling, especially now that homeschooling has actually been mandated in the United States. Who'd have ever thought that would have happened? And so from all of us here at TBR Radio, I want to wish you a very happy Easter And I look forward to seeing you again next week. Until then, remember, he is risen.